Welcome to the Substance of Sustainability. My name is Levine van Zon, and in this series of articles and podcast episodes I look for better ways to talk and think about sustainability. I think that we can do better than either naive optimism or doomsday pessimism. Instead, I will examine ideas from a variety of different fields. This episode is an audio version of an article I published on Substack and on my website sustainsubstance.org. In it, I will talk about the shared stories of progress and decline, and about alternatives. Enjoy this episode. The Future is Fiction. On Progress, Decline and the Need for Active Hope. By Levine van Zon. We are so often presented with predictions for our future that it's easy to forget that the future hasn't happened yet. By definition, all stories about the future are fiction. Yet we need expectations about the future, if only to plan ahead and to coordinate with others. In this episode, I argue that the future is still undetermined and mostly unknown. Contrary to what many stories suggest, progress isn't assured and decline isn't inevitable. We should avoid prophecies and instead build a capacity for active hope. Hope is not passive wishful thinking or blind optimism. It requires agency, engagement, and a willingness to confront obstacles. In the face of uncertainty, hope offers a constructive way forward, one that counters both resigned pessimism and uncritical faith in progress. As Rebecca Solnit puts it, hope is not a lottery ticket. It is an axe you break down doors with in times of crisis. As a Danish politician quipped in the late 1930s, it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. It is notoriously difficult to predict how well an organization or an economy will do in the near future. Unexpected things can and do happen. Yet this rarely deters us. Businesses and governments produce a relentless flow of forecasts, acting as though we can see into the future. But these predictions actually mean very little. By definition, they exclude the unpredictable, and it is the unforeseen that usually has the biggest impact. Consider Jaguar Land Rover. At the close of 2024, the British car manufacturer projected a bright outlook for the coming year. Sales were climbing, particularly in the US, and profits were exceptionally high. 2 months later, Donald Trump's inauguration as US president brought immediate tariff hikes on imported vehicles. Not long after that, a cyber attack crippled the company's production lines for weeks. Within half a year, the 103-year-old manufacturer swung from record profits to substantial losses. Unsurprisingly, neither shareholders nor management had anticipated this reversal. What happened to Jaguar Land Rover may seem exceptional, but it is not. The thinker and trader Nassim Nicholas Taleb points out that unexpected things happen constantly, and we mostly fail to anticipate them. He coined the term black swan to describe an unexpected event or trend that ends up having a significant impact, precisely because most people did not see it coming. Examples include the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks, the 2008 financial crisis, and the recent wars in Ukraine and Iran. More gradual examples are the actual long-term impacts of technologies such as the internet, smartphones, and AI, rather than the effects that we imagine beforehand. Of course, there are always people who correctly predict the unexpected, or who cause it to happen. The European powers were surprised when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, but presumably Adolf Hitler was not. Unexpected and unpredictable are relative terms. Also, they are mostly about the timing and impact of events or trends. We can be certain that recessions, earthquakes, epidemics, and armed conflicts will occur, just as they have throughout history. But we cannot know the specifics, where, when, and how they will happen, and what their effects will be. We know with certainty that the global climate is changing, but we can't really predict precise regional impacts, let alone the cascading effects on societies and communities. Similarly, we know that the current military conflict between Iran and the US and Israel will have significant effects, both in the region and on the global energy system and the world economy. But at the time I record this, we cannot know precisely what the effects will be. In an earlier episode, I discussed complex adaptive systems, emphasizing their inherent unpredictability. Our economies and societies are such systems. We cannot predict their future very well, yet we often behave as if we can. Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls this epistemic arrogance, an overconfidence in our knowledge, especially our knowledge of the future. This arrogance also leads us to rationalize surprises after the fact, often insisting we should have seen this coming. While correctly predicting the future is hard, explaining events in hindsight is easy. We convince ourselves that what happened was obvious all along, a phenomenon known as hindsight bias. When we think about the future, we mentally simulate it by imagining possible worlds. We draw on selected trends or examples from the past and present, and we project these into imaginary future scenarios. This remarkable human ability is known as mental simulation, mental time travel, or mobile consciousness. We construct scenes in our imagination and transport ourselves within them, either as observers or participants. The scenarios we use to simulate the future are usually based on our experiences and on the stories we have been exposed to. Our culture and social groups provide a wealth of grand narratives, stories that we share and consume, and which act as templates for our mental simulations. Such stories can be about the past, the present, the future, or about entirely fictional realms. In every case, they shape our expectations. When envisioning our collective future, we broadly use one of two story templates. One is the narrative of progress, in which our future will be better than the past. The other is the narrative of decline, in which the past was better than the present or the future. The human mind, however, is far from consistent, so we can shift between these perspectives, depending on mood, social context, subject matter, age, etc. Perhaps the most common expectation we have about the future is that it will more or less resemble the present. But this isn't really an interesting narrative, so it isn't shared much. Of the future-oriented narratives we do share, that of decline has historically been the most prominent. The ancient Greeks believed that their society was in decline after a golden age. Many of the great religions center around the story of moral decline, and therefore a necessity for savior, redemption, or enlightenment. In 18th century Europe, Romanticism emerged as a response to perceived social decline, driven by the growing influence of money, profit, and trade. Some Romantic thinkers imagined a further genetic and cultural decline due to racial mixing, fueling the 20th century rise of fascism and ultimately the Holocaust. Today, narratives of decline remain prominent, focusing on issues such as climate change, mass immigration, or artificial intelligence. In my previous episode, I explored some of the unconscious mental biases that influence our perceptions and expectations. These biases can profoundly shape our views of the past and the future. For instance, we tend to think more in terms of decline as we get older. Our physical state deteriorates, and we may start to idealize memories from our past. Rapid changes in the world around us fuel uncertainty about what lies ahead. Moreover, negative emotions such as fear capture our attention more effectively than do positive emotions. This is known as negativity bias, or the negativity effect. It causes us to pay more attention to negative events than to good news. We therefore tend to overestimate the probability of bad things happening, at least when it comes to the actions of other people, or external forces beyond our control. Interestingly, the negativity effect does not apply strongly to our own actions. When we feel in control, we actually tend to underestimate the probability of bad things happening. We overestimate our chances of success and underestimate the risk of setbacks. This is known as optimism bias. It is especially pronounced in children, peaking around ages 8 to 9, though even adults remain relatively blind to potential obstacles. This helps explain why we often fail to foresee crises, even when warning signs may be perfectly clear to outside observers. The combination of optimism bias with the negativity effect implies the following. We are, at the same time, too pessimistic about the world in general and too optimistic about our own abilities and the success of our social groups. While such a dual bias may seem bad, both do serve important functions. The negativity effect makes us risk-averse in unfamiliar or uncontrolled environments, beyond the protection of our social circle. This is a sensible survival strategy. Meanwhile, optimism bias motivates us to take calculated risks when we feel secure. We invest in our future, even when the actual objective chances of success are not that great. This is a potent driver of creativity, progress, and social change. The negativity effect drives our tendency to experience society as being in decline, especially as we get older. However, there is a second, countervailing story template for thinking about the future: the narrative of progress. In our personal lives, we find the greatest fulfillment when we feel we are progressing towards some kind of meaningful goal. But as a major social narrative, an explanatory story broadly shared within society, progress is relatively new. Medieval Europeans saw the future as largely beyond their influence, shaped instead by fate and divine providence. The Enlightenment, however, weakened the existing social order and the role of religious narratives. It promoted individual freedom and the development of scientific knowledge. This mainstreamed the idea that we can influence and improve our future through individual and collective action. One of the consequences was a string of popular revolutions in Europe and the Americas, from 1765 to the mid-19th century. Another consequence was economic theory. The Enlightenment gave rise to at least two strands of progress thinking. The first centered on collective action towards social improvement, while the second framed progress more as a natural law. The first, more progressive school of thinking eventually inspired civil rights movements and helped shape the modern democratic welfare state. Historically, it has been very important, but it is also inherently a destabilizing force. After all, the whole point of social change is to move beyond the status quo, rather than accepting society in its existing form. A second strand of progress thinking therefore originated with liberal thinkers, who did not feel altogether comfortable with the idea of self-determination for the masses, or the social unrest that came with it. Rather than seeing progress as the result of social action, they preferred to see it as a natural outcome of economic growth, human ingenuity, and technological advancement. This view of automatic progress gained dominance in the West, especially after World War II. Progress became institutionalized as something that is linked to economic growth and that can be measured and to some degree managed by experts. The relative stability of the post-war decades also showed that, as long as the majority of the population expects a future increase in their well-being, progress can be a stabilizing force in society. Modern narratives of progress frequently imply that there is little need to solve problems collectively, through forward planning, because most problems will be solved by technology and economic growth. There are, however, issues with this vision of the future, of which I shall mention two. First, while technology has undeniably played an important role, it has often been secondary. If we define progress as an improvement in human well-being, its primary drivers were mostly not technological. Rather, progress over the last 3 centuries was largely based on the vast expansion of human knowledge, following the scientific revolution, coupled with education, popular emancipation, significant shifts in moral thinking, and the development of effective rules and institutions. The suppression of infectious diseases stands as a remarkable achievement, yet it was accomplished through relatively straightforward measures: hand washing, sterilizing medical equipment, and separating human waste from drinking water. Antibiotics and vaccination have arguably contributed most to our longevity and health, but both rely heavily on naturally evolved systems and substances. We didn't so much invent these as figure out how to use them. Many other aspects of improved human well-being have even less to do with technology. Rather, they result from moral and social progress, shifts in what we collectively consider acceptable and unacceptable. These moral shifts were promoted by the emergence of new concepts, such as human rights, and by collective action in the past. The second issue can be summarized, paraphrasing the great thinker and soccer legend Johan Cruyff, as "every advantage has its disadvantage." Progress is often portrayed as something that occurs along a single dimension, a single line on which we should always move forward. However, a development that is positive in one respect can produce negative consequences elsewhere, even if these are not immediately apparent. Antibiotics, for example, have saved countless lives over the past century, but their overuse has fostered widespread antibiotic resistance. This reduces our future options for suppressing pathogens, a problem that cannot easily be fixed by technology. Similarly, cheap fossil fuels have enabled modern life and current levels of food production. But many of the negative side effects take decades to show up, and changes in global climate will have unforeseen consequences for centuries to come. Like any story about the future, the narrative of progress is based on a certain selective way of viewing the past and the present. Much of what we regard as progress now may ultimately undermine our well-being in the future. In fact, this latter insight is at the core of many decline narratives. Proponents of progress argue that it will occur in the future because it has occurred in the past. But this is an arbitrary extrapolation. The future hasn't happened yet, and it offers few guarantees. Moreover, the past is itself a narrative, a mental simulation of what happened, based on incomplete and selected information. The notion of automatic progress may rest on questionable assumptions. Yet, this does not mean that progress itself is a bad narrative. Granted, it's a fiction, but it's certainly a useful one. The very possibility of progress can provide a motivation to act under uncertainty, which can make progress a self-fulfilling prophecy. Indeed, modern society cannot operate without some faith in future advancement. As the sociologist Jens Beckert argues, most economic decisions are future-oriented and cannot be conducted without holding assumptions about the future. Since the actual future remains unknowable, we base our decisions on fictional expectations, collectively imagined scenarios of what the future will be like. In the context of economics, our shared expectations enable coordinated decision-making in a complex and uncertain economic landscape. We collectively act as if our fictional expectations more or less represent the future. Beckert suggests that economic and technological forecasts are rarely accurate, but also that they do not need to be. They mostly need to be persuasive, inspiring the confidence required for action. Even if future-oriented decisions on, say, investment prove to be misguided in retrospect, we still need them to keep our socio-economic system going. While this is not always a good thing, it is a reality that we must acknowledge before we can deal with it. As mentioned, the belief that progress is possible is in itself empowering. It can motivate us to improve current conditions through individual or collective action. In fact, a similar argument can be made for the narratives of decline. The prospect of social or natural deterioration may feel disempowering if we perceive ourselves as having no agency. But the possibility of decline can also motivate us to take action, to solve problems in the present and address likely challenges in the future. Progress and decline are both narrative fictions, but we do need such fictions to engage with possible futures. Future fictions are essential for decision-making. However, if we grow overly convinced that a fictional scenario is what will really happen, effectively treating it as a prophecy more than a possibility, we become blinded to alternative outcomes. Nassim Taleb calls this tunneling, and he warns that it leads us to ignore real-world risks and opportunities. And if that isn't bad enough, it makes us susceptible to manipulation and can ultimately undermine democracy. Our mental visions of the future are prime targets for marketers, politicians, and propagandists, because our expectations strongly shape our plans and our behavior. Propaganda frequently seeks to sell us a single narrative of what lies ahead, suppressing uncertainty and vilifying rival perspectives. Decline narratives are particularly potent in this regard, which is why ambitious politicians often focus on issues that are perceived as going downhill. Decline narratives exploit the negativity effect. By tapping into emotions such as fear or anger, they very effectively hold our attention. When combined with a sense of agency and the support of a like-minded social group, decline narratives can become a powerful catalyst for action. As environmental and civil rights movements have shown, non-violent collective efforts may end up enhancing societal well-being. But as more conservative commentators often note, collective action can also turn violent, leading to widespread destruction and loss of life, as evidenced by pogroms, wars, and ethnic conflicts across history. Problems mostly occur when we are presented with narratives that are too deterministic, and that lack the perspective of an open future, in which we have time to act and talk things over. If a decline is presented as imminent, with very little time to prevent it, the need for action becomes urgent. Whether the perceived peril is climate catastrophe, the specter of a shadowy elite, or the fear of mass migration, the proposed solution rarely includes measured debate or a compromise among competing interests. This issue is not confined to stories of decline. Also, the narratives of progress tend to be overdetermined. If it is already certain that science, innovation, and technology will save us in the end, Why bother trying to fix social or environmental problems through the complicated, messy and slow process of social dialogue and reform? Better to move fast and break things, or, more commonly, to sit back and let progress run its course. While the narratives we encounter are often overly deterministic, another issue is what we might call story poverty. In The Narrative Brain, Fritz Breithaupt argues that the problem lies not with stories themselves, but rather with a lack of alternative storylines. We have too few narratives to choose from when imagining the future. This is especially evident when we are asked to envision meaningful alternatives or even mere structural reforms to the current socio-economic system. The mainstream response for the past half-century or so has become so entrenched that it has its own acronym, TINA. There is no alternative. Given how widely this belief is held, one might think that there has been some seriously effective propaganda at work. In fact, little explicit propaganda was required. What happened was a cultural shift, which the British political scientist Jonathan White calls the privatization of the future. During the second half of the 20th century, the Western world increasingly shifted its focus from collective to individual futures. This was partly a pushback against the more collectivist ideologies of fascism and communism, and partly driven by the rise of mass production and consumer marketing. Rather than changing society, which is a long-term collective effort, the dominant goal became to advance ourselves within its structures, as individuals, within our own lifespan. And rather than seeking power, which is always scarce, most people came to pursue happiness, through the acquisition of objects, experiences, and self-improvements. The promise was that we could buy our way into happiness, provided we were sufficiently enterprising or lucky. This cultural shift fostered a competitive mindset. It also made us increasingly skeptical of ideology and collective organization toward common goals, especially if these involve long-term projects that extend beyond our own lifespan. Institutions adapted accordingly. Citizens were recast primarily as consumers and voters in a world of short-term personal choices rather than substantive collective ones. This shift toward a privatized future eventually occurred globally. It has made it very difficult to imagine an alternative society, one that does not revolve around fulfilling our immediate personal goals through consumption. Of course, even if we are focused on our personal lives, we still harbor hopes and fears for our collective future. This is evident from our shared narratives of progress and decline, as well as in the widespread consumption of future-oriented fiction in books, films, and series. The trouble is that we remain mostly passive in the face of these possible futures. We are preoccupied with our personal goals and too focused on choices that revolve around work, family, or consumption. The agency we feel for shaping our shared future feels limited to occasional voting and choosing which things to purchase or avoid. It feels as if we are free to choose our personal path, but not our collective future. The latter appears governed by all kinds of impersonal forces and structures. We seem to have returned to a medieval mindset. We feel powerless to challenge the fate of society, which seems destined to either go forward or backward. It seems we are in a difficult spot when it comes to envisioning the future. On one hand, our outlook is molded by deterministic stories of progress and decline, and on the other, it is constrained by a lack of collective imagination and a requirement for endless economic growth. Where, one might ask, is the scope for genuine agency, for shaping our shared well-being beyond our role as voter, consumer, or employee? One way forward is to cultivate story awareness. When we recognize the narratives that frame our expectations of the future, their grip on us weakens. Our emotions become less of a slave to future expectations, and we can start to see future fictions for what they are. Useful collective tools for anticipating problems, aligning goals, and generating motivation. Our mental simulations of the future are not the future itself. Reality is complex, and what lies ahead remains undetermined. We should avoid fixating on any single account of what is to come. What we need isn't prophecy, in the form of some naive, oversimplified, or deterministic narrative of what things will be like. Aspects of the future will be better than the past. Other aspects will be worse. In the real world, outside of simplified stories, our societies and lives oscillate between periods of flourishing and periods of instability. While death is inevitable for individuals, societies themselves are remarkably resilient. Empires, governments, and institutions may fall apart, cities may be abandoned, and economies may crash. Yet total social collapse is exceedingly rare. This resilience is cause for optimism. The bad news is that historically, endless growth also does not occur. Our societies will inevitably run into difficult times, although these are seldom the end of the world. The narratives of progress and decline have a tendency to downplay human agency. They depict societies as being pushed around by big forces that we common people cannot really control. Yet one of the key reasons why we cannot predict social systems very well is that at any point we do have agency. You can act to alter the future, and so can other people, for better or for worse. The social future is always still open, and we cannot say what it will be like, only what we aspire to and what we fear for. Collectively, humans can do incredible things, or terrible and stupid things, but crucially, we have choices. Which brings us to the subject of hope. Hope is based on the sense that things may perhaps be bad, but they could get better. Hope requires us to acknowledge that the future is uncertain, but also that, in principle, we can act to change it. As used here, the term differs from optimism, wishful thinking, or faith. Optimism and pessimism say something about the expectations we have. The same is true for faith or wishful thinking, which entail the expectation that things will turn out well, regardless of our own actions. Hope, on the other hand, is an active stance, and it requires a sense of agency and possibility. Crucially, there's only so much a single person can do, especially in the face of collective systemic problems. This is why it often requires many people acting collectively to change our shared future in a meaningful way. According to the psychologist Jamil Zaki, the main enemy of hope is cynicism, a conviction that other people generally have bad intentions. To a cynic, there is no point in trying to change the world for the better, because most people are out for themselves and thus have no interest in working toward a better future for others. History, however, demonstrates otherwise. People can and do act against their own narrow interests. We can collectively act to improve the well-being of large groups of people. This is precisely the point of the narrative of progress, at least in its active, non-automatic form. Successful outcomes of collective action include the abolition of slavery, the establishment of workers' rights, the expansion of voting rights to workers and women, and the introduction of basic environmental regulations. Hope, then, means acting, ideally with others, towards shaping a future we desire, while recognizing that there might be difficulties, setbacks, and failures. This requires not only a sense of agency, but also a form of determination, a motivational driving force to keep us going in the face of difficulty. Often, this force is fueled by righteous anger at a moral injustice. Faith or optimism can certainly help as well, although positive expectations are by no means required. What effective hope does require is a degree of epistemic humility. This means that we should be skeptical of our own beliefs and expectations, especially regarding the future, or the supposed bad intentions of other people. What lessons can we draw from all this? First, the future of our societies is inherently unpredictable. We must recognize this and bear it in mind. Narratives about the future are by their nature fictions, even when they feel like inevitable realities. We should acknowledge complexity and try to practice an awareness that our knowledge is provisional and may well be flawed. This is particularly true when it comes to our knowledge of what lies ahead. We are often attracted to future fictions because they seem to offer certainty. Uncertainty feels uncomfortable, but it is not necessarily a bad thing. Accepting it, however, requires practice. By accepting a degree of uncertainty, we enhance our ability to adapt to unexpected developments. It also opens the way to hope, which, in essence, is a practical application of uncertainty. It recognizes that the future may bring challenges, but also opportunities for positive change. Moreover, research in behavioral science suggests that hope is a far more effective motivator than fear. Scaring us into action may work in the short term, but the effect of fear eventually wears off as we get used to it or find ways to avoid it, and worst-case scenarios fail to materialize. Hope, on the other hand, is much more durable. To practice hope, we must do more than just accept uncertainty and the possibility of obstacles. We must also feed our imagination with possibilities of what we can achieve, especially if we work together with others. The news tends to focus on what goes wrong in the world. This is understandable given the negativity effect. Positive news just doesn't capture our attention very well. So to counter cynicism, we should actively seek out examples of people and groups making a positive difference. One good place to start is the Solutions Story Tracker, a resource created by the Solutions Journalism Network. Of course, we should also avoid naivety and wishful thinking, remembering that progress often demands hard work and will encounter setbacks, but this does not diminish the value of such efforts. Effective anticipatory thinking requires us to see both possibilities and possible obstacles, so we should pay attention to both. If we wish to contribute positively to the future, there are many places we can start. A logical first step is to exercise agency within your own privatized future. What can you do in your personal and professional life to improve the well-being of others, human or otherwise? We should, however, keep in mind that as individuals we cannot take full responsibility for solving complex collective problems. What we can do is contribute to their resolution, alongside others. The notion that we can solve systemic issues simply by buying the right products is absurd, as is the belief that technology by itself can solve such problems for us. Cooperative problem solving is difficult and does not happen spontaneously. Yet humans excel at it, and we have developed numerous social mechanisms to make it work, a topic I will explore in my next episode. Some listeners may be fortunate enough to work in an organization that directly addresses societal challenges, big or small. But for many people this is not the case. As Jonathan White describes in his History of the Future as a Political Concept, collective action for social change historically took place outside work, in labor unions and mass political parties. In general, while social decline can be rapid, constructive social progress is usually slow. It often unfolds in fits and starts over generations, because it has to contend with established interests and power relations. It is a collective endeavor requiring patience and determination, so some form of organization is essential to drive social progress. In the past, mass political parties often filled this role, but today many parties focus more on catering to voters as consumers. Modern voters share some of the blame for this. We have grown so accustomed to acting as consumers rather than active citizens that we treat party manifestos as shopping lists of short-term promises. Still, this is no reason to dismiss democracy entirely. It may be imperfect and can certainly be improved, but it remains the least flawed system we have for collective problem solving in large complex societies. Engaging more actively in local or national politics, directly or indirectly, is one way to help shape our collective future. But politics is not the only arena for action, and when it comes to social change, it often follows rather than leads public opinion. So participate in local communities, join discussion groups, cooperatives, NGOs, activist groups, or contribute to education, to name just a few options. Ideas on what is valuable and how to improve society need to spread before they can make an impact, and true social interaction and discussion is still the best way to do that. Moreover, as I will discuss in my next episode, rebuilding trust and building community are vital for effective cooperation. The key is to take responsibility and avoid both cynicism and naivety. We cannot see into the future, but we can contribute to it. Stories of decline may be highly useful as warnings, but they are not prophecies. Technology and economic growth are valuable, but not sufficient, and come with unintended side effects. Progress, understood as increased well-being, is possible, but it does not happen by itself. Thank you for listening to The Future is Fiction, on progress, decline, and the need for active hope. Do you want to be notified when future articles and podcast episodes are published? Subscribe to my Substack, lvzon.substack.com. Also, if you're interested in further reading, notes and illustrations, you can check out the full article at lvzon.substack.com or at sustainsubstance.org. Thank you for listening.